y'all come from? Hey, and you followed instructions. You came down to the front. I applaud you. You did great. It's really good. Uh, Even though this story is about me, it's more than that. It's a story about a sovereign God who is in total control and can take the tragedies that we go through in our life and work them for our ultimate good if we'll allow Him to do so. So you're going to have to travel back through the years quite a ways, 60-something years. One of my grandchildren asked me one time, said, "Mimi, how old are you?" I said, "I'm old as dirt." She said, "Oh, Mimi, come on. How old are you, really?" I said, "Well, when I was a little girl growing up, we didn't have electricity in our house." She kind of looked at me funny, She couldn't imagine that. And I said, "And we didn't have a telephone." "You didn't have a telephone?" And I said, "And we didn't have TV." "You didn't have TV?" Her eyes just got bigger and bigger. And I said, "And we didn't have cell phones?" She said, "Mimi, you are old." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You must have been Little House on the Prairie." I said, "Well, not quite that far back, but almost, because I went to a one-room, one-teacher schoolhouse that taught all 8 grades in that one room. So almost Little House on the Prairie, but not quite that far back." But anyway, I told the Lord a long time ago, it's hard for me. It brings back a lot of unpleasant memories to share my story, but I told Him a long time ago, "Lord, if you can use it to help people to deal with maybe some unforgiveness or resentment or disappointment or heartache, or if you can use it to help someone come to know the Lord, maybe that was a copycat Christian like me for so many years, then Lord, I'll be willing to share it. And you'll just help me, and I know you will. But you'll have to travel back 60-something years, back to a little house on the prairie. And I was growing up on a farm in the beautiful rolling hills of West Tennessee. My dad was a cattle and horse rancher, and also was a cotton and corn farmer. And there was always a lot of work to be done on the farm. How many of you were raised on a farm? Anybody? All right. All right. We'll have something in common tonight then. But as you know, there's always a lot of work to be done on the farm. But Mom and Dad were the kind of people that liked to do things that made memories in the life of a child. So we had good times too, and a lot of good memories during those years. And I can remember some of my earliest memories of my dad was him holding me in his lap at night and teaching me the alphabet, and then singing "The Way of the Cross Leads Home" before he took me into bed and gave me goodnight hugs and kisses. And I remember getting to go hunting with him when I learned to not talk too much, because he said, "Linda, you've got to be quiet if you're going to go hunting with me, and because you'll scare the birds away." And so one day I told him, I said, "I think I can be quiet enough now, Daddy." So he said, "Okay, we'll give it a shot." So he took me hunting with him, and I was so excited because my little short legs were running really hard to keep up with his long legs. And we went quail hunting, and we had a bird dog named Old George. Now that was some bird dog, I'm telling you. He could find those coveys of quail. And I don't know if you've ever seen a bird dog do his work, but when they spot that covey of quail, because the quail are on the ground, so you don't see them. They blend in with the environment. And that bird dog can spot them. And when they do, they raise their paw and point toward those quail. And then they flush them, and they'll start flying. And Dad would shoot into that covey of quail, and Old George would retrieve them and bring them back to Dad. And Dad would clean them, and we'd take them home, and Mom would cook them, and we'd have quail and biscuits and gravy for breakfast. And I can almost taste it right now. And also, I can remember standing on a stool and helping Mom wash dishes. And I could remember going out to the woodpile and bringing in wood for the old wood-burning cook stove that we used to cook on. And I asked her one day if I could not do that chore anymore because I found a big old snake in the woodpile. And I really didn't want to do that anymore. And I can also remember going down the hill to get water. We had a well at the base of the hill, and we'd go down there and we'd let down the wooden bucket and bring up water and fill our pails, and then we'd carry it back up to the house. I tell people we didn't have running water, but we had walking water. We walked down the hill and got it, and we walked back up the hill with it. And I can also remember that in the winter when it would snow in Tennessee, sometimes we'd have 16, 18 inches of snow. We never had snow days, never got out of school. Dad would just saddle up the horse, and here we'd go, and we'd get to school. And everybody else managed to get to school as well. And Mom and Dad were very active in the local church, and we were always there. He was the only one of his siblings that went to church. None of his brothers and sisters went to church, neither his mom or dad. But he did, and I think that's why he was such a kind, gentle soul, and wonderful memories of my dad. And I remember in our church back then we had what we called brush arbor days. How many of you know what a brush arbor is? Some of you old-timers know what a brush arbor is. Some of you young people don't know, do you? That's okay. It's okay to say, no, I don't know. But that's when the men in the church would go out and cut down little sapling trees, and they would form a structure, okay, 4 corners, big room, and they'd lay branches over the top, and we'd have an outdoor revival outside. And the men would hang lanterns in all 4 corners of that brush arbor, and we'd have revival. And we'd have it for 2 weeks. We can't even stand Sunday through Wednesday now. It kills us. We would have 2-week-long revivals. And I remember we had one little old lady, little white-haired lady. She loved the Lord, and one night her son got saved, and she pulled her little white handkerchief out of her purse, and she ran up and down the aisle saying, "Praise the Lord, Johnny's come to know Jesus." She shouted all over that place. Like scared us kids to death. We didn't know what in the world was going on. But she was just getting happy in the Lord. And we lived in an old clapboard house with a tin roof, and when it rained, you could hear it. And we didn't have electricity, but we had coal oil lamps for light. And like I said, Dad was a cattle and horse rancher, and God blessed his hard work, and he prospered. And when I was almost 9 years old, he built a new house for Mom and for us. Let me back up a little bit. When I was 5, my little brother was born, David. And I was so excited to have a little brother. And I could not wait for him to grow up and so I could teach him all the things I thought I already knew. And for the next several years, we had good times together growing up. And when I was about 9, Dad built Mom a new house over on the highway. And she was so excited to have a brand new house, new furniture, everything, and we had electricity. And I could remember running through that house and flipping the switches on and off just to see the lights turn on and turn off. I was so excited. And we had another room in that house that we'd never had before. Can any of you guess what that room might have been? Yeah, you were raised on a farm too. That's right. We had a bathroom inside. It was wonderful. And I remember my bedroom, Mom made pink satin drapes for my windows, and it was just beautiful. I could not believe what a pretty house we had. And she began entertaining the Women's Missionary Society because she had a house now that she was truly proud of. And I began riding the yellow school bus to the school in town. Now, that was quite an adventure because I'd never been to a big school before, and we had more than one classroom, and we had more than one teacher. So that was something to learn. So anyway, all of those years were wonderful years for me, and I'm glad I have those good memories because when I was almost 11, I would have been 11 in April, And I remember Dad gave me an early birthday present. He gave me a Tennessee registered walking horse for my birthday in March. And I loved to ride. And I loved that horse. And I named him Lightning because he was golden in color, and when he would run across the green meadows, he just reminded me of a streak of lightning. So I said, he's got to be named Lightning. So I received him in March, and I would have been 11 in April. And March of that year changed my life. One night, Mom cooked a meal for some of our relatives who she was ill, and so we took supper over to them. And we all went over there together. David was 5 years younger than me, so he was almost 5. And we took the meal over there and visited with him a little bit, and then got in the truck and headed home. And I remember Dad making a remark about what a beautiful night it was. He looked up through the windshield, and the moon was out and the stars were shining, and it was a beautiful night. And I remember remarking, yes, Dad, it is. It's a pretty night. And, I felt so safe and so secure there in the front seat of that pickup truck with my mom and Dad and my little brother. And we got home, and Mom and Dad tucked us into bed and gave us goodnight hugs and kisses. And about 11 o'clock that night, a killer tornado came through our community, measuring number 5. About as big as they get. We'd never had a tornado in that part of the country, West Tennessee. They have them pretty often now, but this was back in 1952. We never had one. We were sound asleep. I remember being awakened by a horrible roaring noise, feeling the house move, being lifted in the air, feeling the bed knocking against the wall, and then all of a sudden being pulled out through the front windows of the house. And I was knocked unconscious when I fell to the ground below. And when I came to and stood up, I remember that when I couldn't figure out what in the world had happened. Everything was, I looked around and it was lightning everywhere. Y'all excuse me. I'm going to have to hold on to something. I'm a little bit dizzy for some reason. I remember seeing in the constant flashes of the lightning that there were sheets and debris and the trees, and it was just an amazing but terrifying feeling. And anyway, I began looking for Mom and Dad and calling out for them, and I couldn't find them. And all of a sudden, I heard my little brother crying, and I found him. And he was about 20 yards away with his face down in the mud. And I picked him up, and I could tell he was really badly hurt. And he was bleeding. And I just thought, I've got to get us to shelter. It had been unseasonably warm before the storm came through. And you know how it is sometimes when a storm comes through, then behind it is a cold front. And it had turned cold, and it was pouring down rain and lightning. And I picked him up, and I thought, I've got to get us to shelter. I've got to find some place that I can get us some warmth. And I looked for the barn, and the top part of the barn was gone. The hayloft was gone. But the bottom part was still standing. And I knew that there was a room in that barn where Dad kept cottonseed hulls and feed for the cattle. And I knew if I could just get to that little room in the barn, then I could cover us up with cottonseed hulls and feed sacks, empty feed sacks that was in there. So I picked him up and started walking toward what was left of the barn. And I got there, and I got inside, and I covered us up and tried to get him warm. And he was in and out of consciousness and crying, and I was so fearful for him. And I remember it seemed like an eternity before help came. I was later told it was an hour. But you can imagine to a young girl that seemed like an eternity. It really did. But I remember hearing the engine of a truck come up the hill. And I looked out through the cracks in the barn. And in the constant flashes of the lightning, I could see figures of men with flashlights and lanterns, and I knew they were looking for us. And so I went to the door and I called out for help, but they couldn't hear me because it was raining so hard. So I wouldn't leave David. I went back and sat down beside him, and I thought I'd just wait. Well, they found Mom and Dad first. They were still on their mattress, covered up with debris. They heard Dad groaning. That's how they found him. And Mom was already dead when they found him, and she'd been killed from internal injuries. And so they found some doors, and they used them as stretchers. And they put them on the doors and took them down the hill to waiting vehicles. And then they spread out looking for us. And they were real fearful of what they were going to find and didn't even know if they would find us. But eventually one of the men got close enough to the barn that when I called out, he heard my voice, and they found us. And they took us to a waiting vehicle down the highway, and they took us to a little hospital in Selmer, Tennessee. And they had taken Dad to a hospital in Jackson, Tennessee, which is like 20 miles in the opposite direction. And he died on the operating table from internal injuries. But they took us to this little hospital in Selmer. And I remember that there were so many people that were injured and so many people that were at that hospital that night. It was called the Killer Tornado of 1952. It went through Arkansas and Mississippi and Tennessee and killed hundreds of people. And so many people in our community were killed or injured. And these little hospitals just weren't prepared for that kind of traffic. But they did the best that they could. And stretchers were lined in the hallways, and people were lined up outside. And I remember the doctor that examined us, they took David away almost immediately. And then he examined me, and I really wasn't badly hurt at all. It's amazing to me. I just had a few cuts from glass and some bumps and bruises, and that was it. And maybe some cuts from walking on barbed wire with bare feet, but that was it. And I remember the doctor was very, very kind to me that night. He said, I've been told that you took your brother and kept him warm. And he took the time to put his arm around me, and he said, I just want you to know you're very brave. And if you hadn't done that, your little brother might not have made it because he's in shock, and you kept him warm. And that was a very good thing for you to have done. And he just patted me on my shoulder and gave me a hug. And one of the neighbors was there with me, and so she took me back to my grandparents' house. And I remember we walked in the door, and the house was full of people, and I could hear my grandmother crying. And it wasn't a cry like I'd ever heard before. If you've ever heard a person wail when they cry, it's just from down deep, deep inside them. And I knew that something was terribly, terribly wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to ask any questions. So they took me to one of the back bedrooms and put me to bed. And I couldn't go to sleep because I was remembering all that had happened and wondering where Mom and Dad were and what had happened. What had happened? I thought maybe lightning had struck the house. I'd never heard of a tornado, so I didn't know. But anyway, I laid there in the bed, and I heard people come and go and people crying. And finally, I heard some familiar voices, and it was Uncle Paul in Aunt Virginia, Middleton, that lived in Memphis, Tennessee. And they got there about 4 o'clock in the morning. And what would have been usually about an hour's drive took them almost 6 hours because of the condition of the roads. And when I heard them come in, I heard more crying. And eventually, Aunt Virginia came back to the bedroom where I was in the bed, and she saw that I was awake. So she came over and knelt down beside me, and she just pulled me up into her arms. And she said, Linda, I need to tell you something, honey. And I need for you to be very, very brave. Said, your mom and dad went to heaven tonight, and they're there with Jesus. So I knew that they were gone. And even though it's been 65 years ago, it's still hard. Still hard. And I knew they'd never be back. and she held me while I cried myself to sleep. After the funeral, which was so very difficult, there were so many funerals that week. I know they had 3 funerals in the church the day that my parents were buried. It was just so many deaths in that area. But anyway, the family all got together trying to decide what was to become of 2 little orphans. And that's a pretty huge responsibility. And Aunt Virginia and Uncle Paul wanted to take us home with them, even though they already had 4 children and took care of my invalid grandmother, my mother's mother. But they had such big hearts and they wanted us. But my grandfather, on my dad's side of the family, said no, very, very emphatically. You would have had to have known him. He was a very stern, cold, unyielding man. And whatever he said went. Nobody ever disputed his word. So we stayed there with those grandparents. I was never asked what I wanted, but I did not want to stay there because I knew what kind of a person he was. But Aunt Virginia left and went back to Memphis, and I guess maybe they thought we'd be more comfortable in familiar surroundings, in the same school and around people that we knew. But anyway, that's where we ended up. And from that day forward, my life changed because it was no more a warm, loving family. Very harsh, very cold, very abusive family. I was expected to perform the work of an adult, and that's what I tried my best to do for the next several years. Had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, milk several cows, help feed, and come in and eat a silent breakfast. My grandfather would not allow us to talk at the meal. He said, you come to the table to eat, not to talk. No words will be spoken. So we ate silently. And I remember one time he got so mad because he didn't like one of the meals that my grandmother prepared that he picked up his plate and threw it on the floor and broke it into 1,000 pieces. And I can remember him kneeling before the fireplace, and his hands were so calloused that he'd rake a live coal onto his pipe to light it. And I remember one day he picked up a snake by its tail and popped its head against a fence post to kill it. Now, that's not somebody you're going to oppose. And he drank periodically, and when he drank, he would think nothing of beating you if you didn't measure up to what he had wanted you to do. The only problem was you never could figure out what that was that he wanted you to do. So those were very dark years for me. I'm thankful that my brother didn't suffer the same abuse that I did, and I think it's because he was so badly hurt and that he reminded them of the son that they had lost. And so they were much easier on him, and I'm very thankful for that. It was hard enough growing up without a mom and dad if he'd had to gone through all that I went through. And I'm thankful he didn't have to. But I remember I would have to pick cotton in the summer and help haul corn and haul hay and anything you can think of on the farm that an adult did, I was expected to do it as well. And I remember that my hands would break out from allergy to the milk, and they would break open and bleed. But that wouldn't keep me from having to go back to the cotton patch the next day and pick cotton. And the thorns, if you've seen a cotton boll, you know it has little thorns around it that you have to pick the cotton out of. Well, those thorns would pierce the sores on my hand and make them bleed even worse. And I picked many, many pounds of blood-stained cotton. So you can imagine the bitterness and the resentment and the hate that was in my heart toward my grandfather. And I knew he didn't love me, and I knew he didn't want me. I heard him tell my grandmother one night, I overheard the conversation, well, we had to keep her. What would the neighbors have thought? So, they really, I knew, did not want me. And I didn't want to be there either. But I didn't really have a choice. So I remember when I got to be a teenager, you know how you get when you get to be a teenager, you get rebellious. And I got so sick and tired of being treated the way that I was treated. And so one night I just stood up to him. for the first time and told him what I thought about him. It wasn't very nice words that I used, and I told him I wished he was dead and in hell, and I knew that's exactly where he was going, and it couldn't be soon enough for me. Well, that was not the right thing to have told my grandfather. He beat me very badly that night. And I remember when he finished, my grandmother and my aunt came in, and they tried to clean up my cuts and help me, and they just kept saying, Linder, that's what they call me, Linder. Linder, you should have kept your mouth shut. You know what a temper he has. You shouldn't have crossed him. And what I couldn't believe was that he made me go to school looking the way I looked the next day. Both my eyes were swollen almost shut, and I had obvious injuries on my face. But I don't know, maybe he was hungover, he didn't know, he didn't care, but he made me go to school. And I remember walking into the school and all the kids saying, what happened to Linda? And my teacher took one look at me and said, Linda, come with me. Let's go to the principal's office. Let's have a talk. And we got in there, and they asked me what had happened. And I told them, and they said, we can't let you go back to that house. Is there someone else we can call? And, of course, I thought of Aunt Virginia and Uncle Paul. And I told them about them and that they lived in Memphis, and they got their name, and they got in touch with them, and they told them what had happened. And they said, you keep her at school. We'll be there today to get her. So they came down that very same day, and there was quite a confrontation with my grandfather. And my uncle told him in no uncertain terms what he thought about him. And they got my few belongings, such as they were, and they took me that very same day to go live with them. But they wouldn't let my brother come, and we were split up, and that just broke my heart because I loved him dearly. I had been the one that had to tell him about Mom and Dad. My aunt took me to the hospital to see him after the storm. And when we pulled up in the parking lot, she said, Linder, I can't tell David about Ford and Ann being gone. And you've been like a little mother to him, and you need to be the one to tell him. And so that's the day I left my childhood behind forever, when I walked down the hall of that hospital and into David's room. And he, 5 years old, asking for Mom and Dad. And I'm thinking, how in the world am I going to tell him that they're no longer here? And I tried my best to think of the words that Aunt Virginia had used to tell me. And I told him, I said, David, they've gone to heaven to be with Jesus. Well, he's 5. He didn't know what I was talking about. He didn't understand. All he wanted was Mom and Dad. And so finally I had to use the dreaded word. I had to say, David, they're dead. And he knew what that meant. When you're raised on a farm and you lose farm animals from time to time, you know what death is. And so he finally dawned on him what I was talking about, and he knew they would not be back. Those years were very hard for him, very hard for me. And the storm was never talked about. My grandparents never mentioned my mom and dad. They never talked about the storm. It was almost like it had never happened. I don't know if that was just their way of dealing with it or what, but it was never mentioned. And that is a terrible way to deal with grief, because you will deal with it. You have to work your way through the grieving process, and sometimes it takes a long time. But we didn't really actually deal with all of that until many years later, when we had to work through that process. It was hard on David, and it was hard on me as well. But going to live with Uncle Paul and Aunt Virginia was like stepping from darkness, into light. They were a wonderful Christian family, and they loved the Lord, and they started taking me to church, and I began to find out that God wasn't just a mean old God up in heaven waiting to take away parents from little boys and little girls, that he was really a God of love. But because of the original sin in the Garden of Eden, that we do have tragedies and we do have troubles that come into our life, but that God is there to help us and to walk with us through those times if we'll allow him to do that. And so I was really struggling with my bitterness toward God at that point, because I had really not only hated my grandfather, but I had a hate in my heart toward God, because I thought, how can God be a God of love and take away parents from little boys and little girls and then put us in a situation in a home to live like that and go through all that we had to go through all of those years. So I really didn't understand, but I began to understand that God didn't do that to me on purpose, that He was a God of love, and He would be there to help me if I would let Him. And Aunt Virginia knew I was struggling with that, and they were having church camp that summer, and she said, Linda, why don't you go to church camp with us this summer? So I did. I went with them, and I remember the last night of church camp, we had a campfire service. Have any of you ever been to church camp? You have a campfire service the last night, and the preacher preached on hell. Now, you can imagine listening to a sermon on hell and looking at that campfire. And when he gave the invitation, I thought, well, I don't want to go to hell, so I think I'll go down and see what I can find out about this. And so I went down to the front, and they had wooden benches. And I remember kneeling there, and there weren't enough counselors to go around, so no one came and talked to me. My heart was real tender that night, and I think if someone had talked to me and really explained the plan of salvation and how Jesus died on the cross for my sins, and that if I would ask Him to come into my heart and forgive me, that He would, and He'd become my Lord and Savior, I know I would have been saved that night. But no one talked to me like that. And I just basically cried and prayed and asked God to forgive me for hating Him, for taking my parents. So I just forgave God that night. That's what I did. And Aunt Virginia finally saw me over there, and she came over and knelt down beside me, and she said, Linda, did you get victory tonight? Now, if she had asked me if I got saved, it probably would have been a totally different conversation. But she said, did you get victory tonight? And I thought, yes, I did. I got victory over hating God. I forgave God tonight. And I looked at her and I said, yes, Aunt Virginia, I did get victory tonight. And she turned to someone and said, isn't it wonderful? Linda got saved tonight. We've been praying for her, and we just knew that sooner or later she was going to come to know the Lord. And Aunt Virginia was so excited. She had been a second mama to me. She had loved me. She had taught me how to sew. She had taught me how to cook. She had bought me new clothes. She treated me like one of her children. I was their fifth child. And she showed me so much love. And I just thought she hung the moon. And I thought, well, if she thinks I got saved, then maybe that's what happened. So I didn't dispute her. And I just thought, well, I'll just look around at my new family and all the people at church, and I'll just figure out what all this saved business is about. And I thought, well, I'll need to get me a Bible. All the people that are Christians have Bibles. So I got me a Bible, and I said, well, I need to pray. So I've started trying to pray, and of course, you know, I didn't feel like they got any higher than the ceiling, and every time I tried to read the Bible, it didn't make any sense to me. But I didn't give up. I just kept on, and I set some really high standards for myself. I thought, I'm not going to date a boy unless he's a Christian. And morally, I was really good, and on the outside, I was a really good person. I hadn't been changed on the inside, but I did all the things on the outside that any Christian would do. I became what you would call a copycat Christian. I copied what I saw other people doing. And I did that for a long, long time. And I began going with the youth director to a Bible study on Tuesday nights there in the city of Memphis. About 100 young people would meet on Tuesday nights and study and sing. And so I started going with them to the Bible study. And you'll not believe who the song leader for that group was. His name was Larry Rice. And girls, I was so impressed. Now, he's what you girls would have called a hunk. I'm telling you. I know he doesn't quite look like that now, but you got to remember he's a papaw. He's a grandpa, and he kind of fights the middle-age spread and all these things that happen to us as we get older. But girls, he was a hunk. He was the star athlete in town. His picture was always in the paper for all the athletic prowess that he had. He was all state, all county, all everything, just Mr. It. and a Christian. I thought, wow, this guy's too good to be true. And I thought, well, he would never look at me. He would never, ever look my way. I figured I was just a country bumpkin, been brought to the big city and kind of cleaned up, and I thought he'd never give me a second look. But you know what? He did. He really did. And he started hanging around me after Bible study and talking to me, and finally called me and asked me for a date. But the first question he asked me, he said, Linda, are you a Christian? Do you know the Lord? Tell me about when you got saved. And I told him about church camp and that I had gone down during the campfire service. And even as I was telling him, I was knowing down deep in my heart that I wasn't really telling the truth. I was just putting on a front. But that's what I told him, and he accepted that as truth. And so we started dating. And during the 2 years that we dated, I began to tell him about my life and about the storm and what all I had gone through. And he just got this stunned look on his face. And he said, Linda, you're not going to believe this. When I was in high school, my English teacher, who was a Christian, brought the newspaper to school one day. And on the front page of that newspaper was a picture of a 10-year-old girl and how she had saved her little brother's life by taking him to shelter and keeping him warm. And she read that story to the class. And she said, class, I think we need to pray for this young girl and her brother. And that's back when you could pray in school. So that was a long time ago. And she knew Larry was a Christian. And so she said, Larry, why don't you stand and voice a prayer for Linda and her brother David and pray for their future? Can you believe that? He stood in classroom that day and prayed for Linda and her brother and for their future, little knowing he would not only meet, but eventually marry that very girl he had prayed for in school that day. Now, I'm telling you, folks, the sovereign hand of God brought us together. There is no doubt in my mind about that. And so he was in the process of being drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals. I couldn't think of the word, to play professional baseball. He had always wanted to play baseball his whole life. His mother said he loved it, loved it, loved it. He'd go to bed at night with a baseball bat and a glove and a ball, and he just would eat and drink and sleep it. Had ever since he was a little bitty boy. And, to get to the point where you're being talked to by a professional team, you have to be pretty good. Now, he was a pitcher. And even back in the Stone Age, he'd pitch almost 100 miles an hour, so that's pretty good. So he was so excited to play professional baseball, and I just thought that would be awesome. He asked me to marry him, and I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be great. He's going to be a professional baseball player, and we're going to make all this money, and we're going to do all this traveling, and life is going to be great, and I began to make all these plans. And we do that a lot of times. We make plans for our life, and then God tells us He has another plan for us. And Larry went to a Billy Graham crusade without me. I think that was ordained, that he went without me. And Billy Graham preached that night a message to young people, challenging them to surrender their life to full-time Christian service. And Larry said it was just like God was speaking directly to him in almost an audible voice, but it wasn't. But just saying, Larry, I want you to play ball for me. So he went forward that night and gave up his dream of being a professional baseball player and told the Lord, whatever you want me to do, I surrender my life for your service, Lord. From this day forward, you just tell me, and I'll do it. Well, when he told me what he had done, I wasn't quite as excited about that future as I had been about the other one. I never had seen a rich preacher. Still haven't, as a matter of fact. But you know how young love is. You think, well, it's all right if we have to live in a cabin with a dirt floor. We'll make it. And so I told him, I said, that's fine. Whatever you feel like you need to do, I'll support you. And so anyway, we got married, and I went to work, and he went to school. And to to get the education that he needed to go into that vocation. And on down the road, the Lord gave us 3 children, Kathy, Steve, and Andy. And eventually we were on staff in a church. And all this time, y'all, I was knowing down deep in my heart that I really wasn't a Christian. I didn't have what Larry had. I saw a difference in his life from mine. He had an enjoyment in reading the Word. When he prayed, he was talking to someone. And, you know, when we were dating, we never left on a date without having prayer. We never ended a date without having prayer. And I had so much respect for him and for his spiritual leadership. And, you know, God really began to convict me in my heart that I didn't know him. And it was hard for me to admit that because I had been such a good copycat for so long. And everybody in the church thought Linda was just a wonderful Christian. I sang in the choir, you know. I did everything I could do, worked in the kitchen, even kept the nursery sometimes. And everything that could be done, I would do. And, you know, I just fought that battle, and I thought, well, what would the people at church think if I got saved? You know, what would Larry think if I told him I wasn't a Christian? And I just got under terrible, terrible conviction. And I remember he was gone to do revival one time, and the kids were still little. One of them was still in the crib, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I got up and ran to check the baby's crib and to check the children's room to make sure they were still there, because I knew enough about the Bible to know that if Jesus had come back, they'd be gone, and I'd be left behind. Well, I just couldn't live like that. I just came to the end of myself. And that's what you have to do when you come to the Lord. You have to come to the end of yourself. And I knew I didn't care what people thought. I was going to have to get it settled. So I called Larry at church, and I was crying so hard I couldn't even talk. And I said, come home quick. He was there in 5 minutes. He thought something terrible had happened to one of the kids. And I met him at the door, and I said, honey, I do not know the Lord. I'm not a Christian. And I was crying so hard I could hardly talk. And he said, honey, I knew something was wrong with you, but I didn't know this was what it was. But he said, I tell you what, we can get that taken care of right now. And we knelt in that little bitty living room, that little bitty couch, and that little bitty house at 1627 Duke Road in Memphis, Tennessee. And my husband led me in a sinner's prayer and showed me from the scripture how I could receive the Lord into my heart and into my life. And I prayed that prayer from my heart, knowing that if I asked him to come in, he would come in. And folks, it happened so fast, I couldn't even talk about it in the present tense. You can't say I'm now being saved. I turned to Larry and I said, I'm saved. The Lord has saved me. I know it. Jesus is real to me now. And I know if I read my Bible, it's going to mean something to me now. The grass was greener, the sky was bluer. Everything changed. Everything changed from the inside out. I had lived the Christian life from the outside, but it wasn't from a changed life on the inside that was promoting that. It was all works, just what I could do. And I fooled a lot of people, but I couldn't fool myself, and I couldn't fool God. And I'm so thankful he didn't give up on me. So thankful. From that day forward, it was wonderful. My Bible came alive. I had such a joy in telling people about Jesus. It's different from daylight and dark, just like leaving my grandparents' house and going to live with Uncle Paul in Virginia. Daylight and dark. Well, you know, when you become a Christian, God begins changing you. He began working on me in the area of my hatred and bitterness toward my grandfather. Well, I didn't want to go there. I said, but God, he doesn't deserve to be forgiven. And you know what God whispered in my ear? Linda, you didn't deserve to be forgiven either, but I forgave you. And you know, God never asks us to do anything that He doesn't give us the power and the ability to do it. Seems like every verse I read was on forgiveness. Couldn't get away from it. Had to work through that process. It didn't happen overnight. And by the time I got to the point where I thought that I could really go and talk to my grandfather and forgive him because Jesus had forgiven me, got in touch with my grandmother and found out that he had just suddenly passed away from complications from a surgery that he had had. Then I felt guilty because I hadn't got to tell him about the Lord changing me, and because He changed me, then I could forgive him. I don't know if it would have mattered, but it would have mattered to me because I had told him I wanted him to go to hell, and I didn't anymore. And I was sad that I didn't get a chance to talk to him about the Lord. So a missionary came to our church right after that. Her name was Miss Bertha Smith. She was a missionary to Africa. And I told her about the struggle that I was having. She said, Linda, this is what I would suggest that you do. You write your grandfather a letter, and you put everything in that letter that you would have said to him. And you go out to the cemetery and you read that letter out loud. And you tell the Lord that this is what you would have said. And you just do that. And I said, okay, Miss Bertha, I will. So I wrote a letter to my grandfather, and I went out to the cemetery and I read it. Put all my feelings in it, everything I wanted to say. Told him how that because God had forgiven me, I could now forgive him for all the abuse and all the horrible things he'd put me through all those years. I read it out loud and I said, Lord, you know my heart. If he were alive, this is what I would have told him. And folks, that's the day that God healed me emotionally. He set me free from bondage. Because when you have unforgiveness and bitterness and resentment in your heart towards someone, you're the one in jail. You're the one in bondage. Because most of the time they could care less. But you're the one that's in bondage. And God wants to set us free from that. And He's the only one that can do that. I began to make a study of the names of God. Do you know God has 365 names? That's a name for every day of the year. That's just an awesome thought to me. But the name that came to mean the most to me was Jehovah Rapha, the mighty God who heals. He had healed me of my sin sickness when He came into my heart and saved me. And He healed me emotionally that day at the cemetery when I forgave my grandfather for all the abuse that he had done to me throughout my life. And as I studied the Bible, I found out that the first time that Jehovah Rapha was mentioned was in the Old Testament when Moses was leading the children of Israel out of bondage, and they came to a place called Marah, M-A-R-A-H. It means bitter. And they were thirsty and they wanted to drink some water, but it was too bitter to drink. And God gave Moses some very unusual instructions. He told him to cut down a tree and put it in the water. And then it would become fresh and sweet, and they could drink it. And he did that. And it happened just like God said it would. And as I thought about that, I thought, you know, God gave me a tree. And it was the cross of Calvary. And when I allowed that tree to sink down deep into my heart symbolically, He turned all of that bitterness and hatred and resentment into the sweet presence of Jesus into my heart. And I'm so thankful for that. And He can do that for anybody. Didn't just do it for me. He can do it for anyone. And you know, I think about my life sometimes, and I think about it like baking a cake. You know, there's a lot of ingredients that you put in a cake. And if you taste those ingredients separately, they don't taste very good. Shortening sure doesn't taste good by itself. Soda doesn't. Baking powder doesn't. Flour, you don't take a spoon and eat flour. You know, but when you put the eggs and the sugar and the flavoring and the milk and all of those things and you mix it together and put it in the oven, then it comes out good. Something good. And that's what God does with our life. You know, we have a lot of tragedies, a lot of unhappiness, a lot of things that come into our life that aren't pleasant, that don't taste good. But God, being who He is, can work all of those together for our ultimate good and for His glory. And that's what I want my life to be. I want my life to be for the glory of God. And I just want to tell everyone, don't go through life without Jesus. Don't stand before the Lord someday and have Him say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Don't do that, because we don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't know if we'll be here tomorrow. Our life could be over tonight. Don't take the chance of being wrong. Like Larry said Sunday morning, eternity is too long to be wrong. Make sure that you know that you know that you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. And I just pray that somehow, some way, that God will use it to maybe help you in some areas in your life. And if you don't know the Lord, please don't leave here tonight without Him. God bless you.